Blog Talk Radio.
Live from Washington, D.C., it's Quintessential Listening, Poetry Online Radio. Now, here's your host, Dr. Michael Anthony Ingram.
Good evening and welcome to the program. My guest tonight is award-winning poet and author, Anna Castillo, a prolific writer. Her latest book is My Book of the Dead. Hello, Anna. How are you tonight?
I'm doing good. I'm doing well. How are you?
I'm quite well, and I'm glad to have you with me.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
Yes, let's begin this journey. What is poetry, Anna?
I'm sure your guest, and you've probably read many profound responses to that, and I don't know what I would add to the many definitions of poetry and poetry versus prose. But I was thinking recently that poetry for me is almost like looking into the eye of a hurricane, and the silence that you might feel at that moment, and staying in that moment. I have found that if I get a line, people ask, how do you start a poem? When I get a line, if I grab onto that line, it's like having caught something on your line, on your fish line, and you don't know how big it's going to be. But if you don't follow it and you don't stay with it at that moment, you lose it. So it's got that profound depth and greatness and possibility, but you have to catch it at that moment, and you have to stay with it in that moment. And that's how I feel about writing poetry.
That's absolutely beautiful. I've never heard it in all these years described that way, like a hurricane, the silence that you feel. Wow, incredible.
Thank you.
Why then, knowing that it's incredible, why is it important for all of us to think about poetry?
I was very fortunate to receive an advance praise from a Turkish scholar from Bryn Mawr, who normally she says normally she writes about prose, but she was asked to comment on this book, and I've really appreciated something she said, which is that I was offering in these times the consolations of poetry. And we feel right now, or at least I do, in terms of language, contemporary language, that the word consolations almost sounds a little condescending, like getting a consolation prize or an honorable mention, like I'm offering the consolations of poetry. But if we think of the word consolations as it has been used and traditionally used and poetically used, and I also hear it in my mind in Spanish, and I know it's used this way, it really is the comfort that we, all of us, have been needing in the last 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 years, depending on what's been getting to you. And there's been a lot, as you've seen in the book. So the consolations is that if you take this one poem or this book and you read it at night to yourself in bed, or you decide to read it to your family in the living room, or you take it to the first social gathering, you go and you read it out loud, there is the comfort of hearing someone in that eye, going back to the what is poetry, in that eye of the hurricane, being succinct about that moment that this was going on. And so I appreciate that. I thought it was also a consolation to me to be able to do it, to take one poem at a time during these times where, quite honestly, I didn't feel like writing at all. But I could take one poem and I could work on it at 2 a.m. or whenever it was quiet, and I could focus on something. And I would focus on that moment, on insomnia even, or how it feels like to be up at 2 a.m. and the world is quiet and you only hear your thoughts. So anyway, that's what happened. It brought me back to my writing, which for a while there I thought I wouldn't be working anymore because I was feeling so overwhelmed by everything.
Yes, I can understand feeling overwhelmed. There's so much happening in this world. The bigger world, the smaller world, you name it, there's just so much happening. So much happening. What do you view as being the role of a poet in modern-day society?
Well, going back to that line that this person wrote, the Constellations of Poetry, you know, if we go back pre-internet, of course, maybe even pre-book writing, when you had the bard going from town to town, from village to village, singing or, you know, bringing news. I feel that it's sort of like that. It's because it's such a special way of working with language. You have to stop and really listen. You know, for me to write a novel or an essay versus a poem, so it is a very different process. And for me, writing poetry, if I were a metal worker, it would be like working with filigree. I have to get my lube out to look very closely and not spoil any of the precious metals, and just do the right thing and repeat it and so on, find the motif. So anyway, I feel that's what poetry can do. And I said this recently in a podcast, and I said, well, I'm glad you like the poems and share it with your friends. And they sent me some message that someone wrote and said, share it with your friends. Sometimes we forget that's what poetry is for, to read, you know, and share with people.
Yes, I agree. Please share a poem.
I'd be very happy to. I'd like to read this evening the lead poem in the book. It was written in 2015 in memory of the wonderful activist, Native American activist, John Trudell, who crossed over at that time. He was an activist, but he was also a poet. And so this poem is about him and about 2015. A storm is coming. It is on the horizon. It has traveled far, fast, wide, and taken much in tow. The storm, infused with lies and nitrogen, water, air, ground infused, our fruits and animals infused, our minds infused with lies and nitrogen, we're dumbstruck. Believe ourselves smart when we are instead confused. The tricksters counted on our being caught unawares. They knew our selfishness, greed, most of all, fears. The storm approaches. Can you hear it? 999 hoof-like vibrations beat against our eardrums, and we remain indifferent. We have our things gathered. Our children seem fine. We always rebound. The storm comes and goes, returns. Next time harder. We don't even bother with shelters. We give it new names each time. Further fire and rain. We mourn. We start again. It could have been you or me, we say, dying in public, beneath a baton's blows, falling amid the spray of a sniper's bullets. But it wasn't. We go on. Disaster has happened to someone else. We venture out and buy more, we take more, we discard, we pillage the earth. The storms take sinister forms, go by isms, neo and post hyphenations. Be afraid, leaders of the faceless enemy warn. Beware, be aware when you travel. We cannot protect you. We will be vigilant of your whereabouts. Our watchful eye will know your life. Long lines to survive, much less thrive, lie before you. You'll feel shame like in naked dreams, but worse, because we, in fact, are watching you. We will make sure you don't question. And when the storm is upon you, when it has destroyed your homes and your children are not fine, and your dreams of golden roses and bright days are nowhere but in the pages of a storybook, we will be content in our heavens, eating peeled grapes, zipping fine wines from our vineyards of abundance, sitting on our thrones. New gods will smile down upon you. our creation of ruin. Pick our teeth with your bones. Thank you.
Oh, wow. That was so powerful.
Thank you. And that was 2015. That starts the book. Most of the poems in the book come after that year.
What are some of the predominant themes of your work?
Well, I would say the usual suspects, and they're in all the genres. I've written in almost, I think, all genres. I started very young, and my generation, I was coming of age during the Civil Rights Movement, and as a brown girl in Chicago, I began to question race and racism and what that would mean for me in my life. And once I got in college and was a young woman, I added very serious concerns as a woman. And as time went on, I connected it to sexuality and social justice and disparity, economic disparity, not only in this country but also around the world. I have strong connections to Mexico, and so I did spend a lot of time, my whole life, in Mexico, going back and forth, and as well as other places in Latin America. So those are things that have expanded globally and have continued and into being concerned about climate change and eco-justice and so forth. So all of those are things that are recurring in this book as they have been in my novels and in my nonfiction.
Mm-hmm. Was there a specific early experience where you learned that poetic language had power?
You know, when I was about 19, 20, I was in State University school, and I was majoring to be an art teacher. That's what I kind of settled on at that time. And then something happened, and I started writing poetry, and I was very comfortable with it and even reading it. And I was a very shy woman, so it was astounding to my family that I was doing this. And I decided at that time that I would, this would be the medium. But one day, my mother was in my audience years later, after I began to write novels and had success in poetry as well and so on. And she stood up in the auditorium of that same university and turned around and told the whole audience that, in fact, I had started writing since I was like knee-high. Mm. And when I thought about it, she was absolutely right. And I do remember the first things that I wrote that we could describe as poems, perhaps, if an adult had read them, perhaps. I wrote when I was 9 years old, when my grandmother passed, and that sparked that urge in me to write like that.
When you say write like that, tell me more about that.
Remember when I said about being in the moment, staying in the moment in the eye of the hurricane, and I was first of all, I was already a quiet child, and living in a time and in a culture in which children should be seen and not heard. And my grandmother was my second mother, and it was very it was earth-shattering for me to lose her. But no one asked me how I felt about it. No one ever talked to me about it. And so this was a way in which I began to express that chaos that was going on for me. And in a way that came naturally to me. I'm very fortunate that writing is an easy expression for me. Mm-hmm. And I think I had some success with it because I recall when I wrote these little things, and I was in the school playground at recess and reading it to the other children, and they were all asking me to write one for them, and write one for my mother, write one for me. So I think that kind of got me going.
As you think about your body of work, how does a poem begin for you, with an idea, a form, or an image?
It begins with the line, with the phrase, and I've lost many because I just haven't bothered to write it down. And as anyone who's written or tried to write or made poetry their life knows, once it comes to you, you better write it down. Middle of the night, get up, write it down. You're on the train, find a piece of paper. You're in a restaurant, write it on the paper napkin. So I've lost some of them, but I have thought about this question, and it's wonderful when a line comes, and it is like that fish on the hook, and you don't know what comes after that, and there you go. I did that one summer, and it ended up being an entire novel in verse. I just didn't let it go. I kept at it, and 6 weeks later, I had a book in tercets. I just wouldn't let it go. I would take breaks to go walk the dog or go get a cup of coffee or something, and now it's there. It just had its 10th anniversary. It's out there, and I did it in tercets. So there's the aspect of the idea or the image, however it is, someone starts a poem, but now we must think, get serious and think of structure, and so that's what happened. I decided on that form.
All great writers have great writing influences. Who are some of yours, and what makes them great in your eyes?
When I was, I've always loved to read. I went to Chicago public schools, and I loved library time. But the books that I read, even into high school, were written by usually white people, almost always, quite often white men, but they were also people of certain privilege and certain background. I was 11 years old in my little school in Chicago public school when I read Little Women. And so, I can connect perhaps as an adolescent, but I'm not connecting in my background, in my culture, in the way I look and the life I'm having. So when I got older, in my late teens and early 20s, I began to search for people, writers who connected a little better with me. And some of those were early 20th century bohemian writers, Anais Nin, Henry Miller, that whole group. There was the expats. And also what was happening at that time was Toni Morrison with The Bluest Eye.
Yes.
And the Latin American boom. They were Latin Americans writing in Spanish. They were the only Latinos at that time being published in the United States. So I could connect with some of that culturally. With Anais Nin, I could connect with her Catholicism and her observing the difference between herself as an artist and the men that were around her. And so I started to patch together writers and thinkers that would speak to me in different aspects of what was my identity. And they're still very important to me. James Baldwin was huge for me, also in teaching me how to write essays, which, he's speaking of great writers and giants. Yes. So I learned to write essays by reading essayists that I admired. He was one of them. And 1,000 years later, I had the good fortune also of assigning his essays to my graduate classes to study the transitional phrase and ideas and how to put our ideas down.
Mm-hmm. If there was someone that you would wish would serve as your mentor, which poet would it be? From now or from historically?
Yeah, to be my mentor, gosh, that would be such a great gift. If someone was willing to be my mentor, I sometimes wonder what, and unfortunately he died quite young, and that was Garcia Lorca. I studied him early on before I had great aspirations as a poet. I studied him in Spanish, as I did Neruda. But I think he had a joie de vivre that I would also like to be around him, to have that too. So if I could have known somebody at that time, that might have been him, because I know that he had a great enthusiasm for life and brilliance. And I would just, even if he didn't mentor me, I'd like to be in a salon one evening hearing him just have a conversation with somebody else if you wanted to.
All right, please share another poem.
I'll be happy to, and I'm going to share a poem that I wrote in Spanish. It was written about the Parkland High School massacre. It was Valentine's Day, and I'll read it in Spanish first, and then I'm going to share the translation here. It's called Gotas caían en el techo. Tic, 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 una puñalada en el pecho del país. Y la noche no pestañaba, ese San Valentín. Un tic, tic, tic caía en el techo y nadie dormía, ni yo, ni mi amor, ni el perro. Con las noticias del último masacre, 17 hijos perdieron sus vidas, alumnos, poetas, líderes del futuro. Fueron 17 almas esa vez. 17, cuéntalos, en sus ataúdes, que nunca llegaron a su madurez. 17 hijos e hijas, cuenta si se puede, las lágrimas de los padres y del pueblo. El terrorismo doméstico con tanta frecuencia en un lugar que se llama democracia ha hecho la muerte banal. Empezó hace siglos atrás. Hombres con armas, odiosos de la humanidad, amantes del poder, ahora se quitan la máscara, el disfraz, con la bendición del señor presidente. Tic, 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 caían las lágrimas del cielo, y nadie dormía, ni yo, ni mi amor, ni el perro. And now I'll share the poem in English, and I want to thank a person who came forth when I put the word out on social media to see if I didn't want to translate my own poems. So I put the word out, and I got numerous responses. And this poem was translated with a little bit with my assistance by a poet himself, is Tahimba Jess, and he really surprised me and said, I'd like to give it a shot. And so this is his translation. And the name of the poem is Drops Fell on the Roof. Tick, 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 a stab in the chest of the country. And the night didn't blink that Valentine's Day. A tick, tick, tick fell on the roof. And no one slept, not my love, not the dog, not me. With the news of the latest massacre, 17 children lost their lives. Students, poets, leaders of the future. It was 17 souls that time. 17, count them, in their coffins that will never grow older. 17 sons and daughters. Count if you can the screams of the parents and the people. Domestic terrorism so rampant in a place that calls itself democracy, that has made death banal. It began centuries ago. Men with weapons, haters of humanity, lovers of power. Now they take off their masks, their costumes with the blessing of Mr. President. Tick, tick, tick. Drops fell from the sky and nobody slept. Not my love, not the dog, not me. Thank you.
Wow. What about that incident made you want to write about it in a poetic way?
Well, I don't know what else. You know, when we lose a child, you know, there's this expression that it takes a village. Well, you know, the world is one village, and all children belong to us. And so when we lose a child, we can't help but go to poetry or to song, to music, or to the sky or to the stars. And so I happen to be that Santa Fe, that's St. Valentine's Day in Santa Fe. It was kind of a dreary day with snow, rainy, and you know, you're thinking, well, you know, I'm going to make the best of it. But you hear this news, And I am a mother, and I'm also now a grandmother, and so
congratulations.
Thank you. But my heart goes out to every mother, every grandparent, every godparent, every auntie, every teacher. When I hear this, we now have bulletproof backpacks. What does that tell you of the times that we live in? So
yes.
The only place I could go to on that day and that moment and that situation was internally. And again, as I've said earlier, you stay in that moment. And I repeat in the poem 17 because we have to think about that. It would be horrific to have 1 or 2 or 5 or 4, but we have 17 children that were lost to this country because of this random violence, and all the families and all the friends and all the neighbors and all the teachers that are affected that day, but we will see 17 coffins. And so I repeat that number so that we take it in. If it was our family, our home, and 17 members in our family were murdered, we wouldn't get over it, and generations to come wouldn't get over it. So that's why I went to poetry. And as I said, I was experiencing a lot of things that were going on personally and globally and nationally on a very personal level. And the only place I could go to would be to poetry.
Wow.
And to reading poetry as well. So it's just being in that moment and the filigree of language.
Wow. Let's take a brief break and we'll be right back. I'm here with Anna Castillo. Her new book is My Book of the Dead. Please share another poem.
Well, thank you. I want to change the tone a little bit. I enjoy enormously reading, as most poets should, and aspiring novelists and so forth. A couple of my favorites are Bukowski and Roberto Bolaño, who was crazy popular a few years ago, and I started ordering everything I could, and then I had read Bukowski years and years ago. I had discovered his poetry, but then I started reading his fiction. Now these, despite their talents and their brilliance as a feminist, I also found them to be bad boys. Yes. And so one night I wrote a poem called Two Men and Me. I left Bukowski again, went back to Bolaño. Both men bad to their women. Me, like the rest, couldn't get enough. Both smoked and drank themselves to death. They liked it rough. Said that was how they got their best writing done. One winter, we all ended up in hell. Ran into each other at a cafe. Parentheses, revision, bar, public bath, fill in the blank. Chuck wanted to fuck. Roberto punched him in the gut. We quaffed a few whiskeys. They knew, I knew. I wasn't that kind of gal. Instead, we set out to do a three-way poem. Tu primero, said Bolaño. What? Bukowski said. No comprendo. How fucked up you gotta be you can't understand Spanish even in hell. Roberto was mad. You illegals, the others started racializing the situation. No wonder he was in hell. Then again, we all were. I'm not Mexican, pinche gringo, Roberto yelled, throwing another swing. This time he got me in the eye by mistake. There are no mistakes in hell, the demon bartender said, handing me some ice. That's the beauty of this place. The guy stopped. No one had ever seen ice in hell. Yeah, it was the start of something big. Thank you.
I like that. I know when I read it, I chuckled then too.
Yeah.
Nice.
Nice. Thank you.
As you think about writing poetry, does it energize or exhaust you?
Well, gosh, no, not really. I think because the thing is about poetry, and don't be fooled by its size. You know, despite my writing a novel in verse, if it's a short half paragraph, it doesn't mean that it doesn't torment you for a year trying to get it right. But I would say overall, writing poetry energizes me. It only depletes me if I don't have it right. If I can't, I'm frustrated.
Okay, tell me more about that.
Yeah, about language, about the idea, and putting this collection together. For example, I worked alone. I don't belong to a writers group. Maybe your listeners might be interested in that. I don't share this with the closest people in my life, with my partner or my son or, my best friend. I was working on my own. And I also made executive decisions on my own as I was organizing the poetry. And so I would very mercilessly throw out poems that I just can't get right. And that means that something about that line, something about that word, if the assonance or the eternal assonance isn't there, if the thought doesn't quite, because you're working with filigree. If you can't get it right, it's very different than working with prose, which is you got a lot of space to say, well, I got like a whole page here. I can get to my thought. You only have a second to get to your thought. And so that's what I mean. That can frustrate me and depress me if I'm not getting it right. But when it works, I'm like high. It's like I want to read it to everybody. I'd like to, share it. I feel it's right there. I've captured that moment.
All right. So what do you think is the most difficult part of the artistic process then?
I have always been, according to my mother, if she were here,
all right.
I've been a very disciplined child.
Okay.
So I think I've always been disciplined, but I think the hardest thing for what I see, and I've given countless of workshops in this country and in other countries, sometimes with a translator, and over decades. And so I've seen a lot of people who want to write or who are being forced to write. If it's a university class, maybe they have to take it. But usually it's people that come on their own. And I think the hardest thing is discipline. I see people wanting to do it, but they don't do it. I see people starting to do it, but they don't finish it. And so staying with it is probably the hardest for most people, and including for myself sometimes. I have a lot of bottom drawer manuscripts, if you will, that I just couldn't get them right. But once you do stick to something, there's so much satisfaction to finishing it. And so I think that would be my sense of it.
All right. Please share another poem.
Yes, I'd be happy to. This poem is, I'm not going to say anything about it. It's a poem that I wrote at a particular time, and it's called When Snow Turns to Rain and It Is Still Winter. I am a Bedouin woman. Burqa waves and drags. Goats graze lazily along red stone. My gaze afar. He was a cheerful boy, my son, the poet. Grew tall like the poplar, with eyes fiery as embers, my son. I mutter, as if he just left the room, scent of his soap lingering. My son, I start each conversation as though my heart were whole as a pomegranate clinging to its branch, alive, my son. Writes verses and lives like a monk among hyenas. He prays, meditates, say it, my son, locked behind walls. I once climbed the jagged hills of Petra, hid within its caves. My son sleeps on a piss-stained bunk, once a boy who had a warm bed, milk, the breast of his mother upon which to rest his head. He read books and played with other children. On the phone now, men are loud and he shouts, Ma, my son. Each bead I pray upon at dawn has his name. My lips murmur, God in your heaven, the chitterling of birds, the desert floor, all the same. Why does the world not long for him as I? God made us strong, this thing called mother. The rain and torrents are Mary's tears that cleanse the weary. My son, soon my eyes will be illuminated with your presence. Thank you.
Anna, tell me about that piece.
Yeah, what do you want to know? I don't know what I want to say about it yet.
Whatever comes to mind that you'd like to share.
Oh, I don't know. Let's talk about it from writing poetry
All right.
point of view.
Yes.
People have asked me, for example, in the past, is it okay if I'm not a Chicana and I can identify with your poetry? Mm-hmm. So I'm writing as a Bedouin woman, and some of my poems, a few of my poems in this book, are persona poems that I take on that person. I am a mother. I have been to Petra. I did climb those caves and those places, and so the images are real for me. But it doesn't. In a way, if it's successful poetically, it almost doesn't matter. People do talk about the authenticity of the voice and the image, and write only about what you know. And at the end of the day, I guess it's not only what you know in poetry and also in fiction. It's what you feel. And so I feel very strongly, as I mentioned earlier with the previous poems, I feel very strongly as a mother and as a woman, as a mother of a brown man. And I merged all of those experiences together to put this, to write this poem at this time. Wrote it in 2013.
2013. I have a habit of, and I'm sure it's many people rather, of reading the titles of the poems first to see what strikes my fancy. Your poems have amazingly detailed titles. What role should a title play for a poem?
That's funny you're asking that this evening, because I am working on, I've gone full throttle back to my writing, and I'm almost done with a collection of short stories, and I'm feeling like the worst titler in the world. Can't come up with a title for the life of me. I've got all these stories and these lines, and I can't come up. And people are always saying, "Well, you got the best title," and so and then they always say, "Well, just use the first line or use the last line. That'll work." And that works sometimes. Two Men and Me obviously was about two men and me. I didn't go use the first or last title. So it has to feel right for you. Once again, it has to be right for you. Something resonates so if you can't wrap it up with something like that, maybe a line in there will work. And then people have fun, getting into it and, oh, okay, I get it now. So I'm happy that the titles work, but I do give them a lot of thought. Mm-hmm. And I do feel that a poem or a story in progress really needs to be named. Once you give it birth, you don't, send a child off to school and say, well, I haven't thought of a name yet, So
right.
Once you, we're going to call him something one day. So once you send it out there, you got to have a name, and it better be a good one. And so,
right.
So that's how it happens for me.
As you know, this is a call-in show, and we had a caller, but they signed off. We almost had a caller. So you're really popular tonight.
Oh, okay.
Let's imagine for a moment that a poem is like a cake, all right? What would be some of the ingredients that go into that particular cake if it's a poem?
Oh, my goodness. Well,
we do
did
it all on this
mention
show.
that line. Okay. All right, I'm busy thinking about the cake. Like, oh, nice, you got me thinking about cake. What do I got in the pantry? And it doesn't have to be a sweet cake.
No, it doesn't.
I think you should add that too. One of those organic vegan cakes that people are like, oh, I had one of those for one of my birthdays, and so it has to be good for you.
Right.
So
right.
I did mention that line has to, and it has to draw you in, and then hopefully it draws your a reader in. You're pulling them in. I'm pulling you in to this world right now, and in this space, and this amount of words. I see a lot of poetry right now in journals and periodicals that feel a lot to me more like prose and broken down lines. So, right. But what I'm talking about, I'm not judging that poetry, but what I'm talking about is a line that's there. And that line doesn't have to have a period. It's an image. It's a thought. It's something that's like you could walk away with it, and that would be the foundation. I guess that would be your flower, So then you start to work with other things. I've told people in my workshops and in my classes, metaphors are very important, and it's wonderful if you do come up with one as long as it's original. If it's not original, it's best to keep that out. If it's a cliche, for sure, don't have it in there. If it's on its way to being a cliche, don't say, I said earlier at the end of the day, if you don't say something in your poem at the end of the day, look for original ideas, original ways to say things that have been said a million times before. And so we're really being very picky about our language and our imagery and capturing the moment. And that moment doesn't have to have an answer. It could be a question without an answer. I think people get stuck with the last line. Mm-hmm. At the last line, it's like a punchline. There doesn't have to be a punchline. It's that moment. And if you've caught it, just like, I watch the sunset out here quite often, and it's so beautiful every single day. Sometimes I think, well, I'm going to run out and take a picture of it. If I think for 3 minutes, much less 5, and I don't get out there, I'm going to miss it.
Yes.
So you want to catch that moment, and that's all you need to do. If you catch it succinctly and the reader is captivated and they walk away with it and there's a line in there or a word you've used, then I think you've been successful.
Oh, wow. Well, it's a great cake. It's a great cake.
Yeah, it feels maybe a little coffee, Turkish coffee.
We have a couple of callers. Anna. Let's bring these people on.
Good.
All right. I told you it was going to be fun. All right.
Thank you.
Area code 773. The first 3 numbers are 372. You're on the air with Anna.
Hey, how's it going? Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Pretty good. Thank you for calling.
Hey, Mom, you sound great up there. I just wanted to congratulate you on your new book, and thanks for reading some of your latest creations for us. Appreciate you.
Thank you. Thanks for calling.
Do you have a question?
The host is really doing a good job.
Right.
Well, I didn't really have a question, but yeah, I remember seeing a lot of these poems in formation when I'd visit her in New York, and it's cool to see the draft kind of become their final draft, because when you're admiring an artist, you're like, well, how do they know when it's complete? And I guess it just kind of spoke to her, and they're like, okay, this one's finished, this one needs a little more work.
Every time I think about that's a good question about when do you know when a poem is done. And as a young poetry lover, reading Walt Whitman, I've never forgotten that he had so many editions of Leaves of Grass, and I feel like I get him now. That he would go back and tweak and change and tweak. So it might never be done to you, because you're a different person every year, or you've changed your thoughts or ideas. So, but at some point, if you have an editor, if you're going to publish it, they'll pull it away from you and they'll say it's time to let go.
Yeah, no, that's a beautiful way to put it, because I feel like a lot of art, like a musician, it's like, okay, this album is done, but people don't know there was like 3 other takes of the same song. To be like, this one, I like this part, the other part, I like this part. So that's exciting to think that you can revisit stuff like you did with Massacre of the Dreamers, where you did like a 25th anniversary. It was like, now you can kind of like update some of the research and talk about how things have changed, how things haven't changed. Like, it seems kind of like a time machine in that sense. Yeah.
All right.
Yes, thank you.
All right. Well, thank you, sir.
You got it. Have a great night, guys.
All right.
Thank you. Have a good evening.
Love you. You too.
Area code 630. The first 4 numbers are 467. You're on the air with Anna. Good evening.
Well, hello, Anthony. Michael.
Hello.
Michael Johnson. How you doing? Michael Lee Johnson.
Hello, Michael Lee Johnson.
How you doing, buddy?
Sir? I'm doing well.
Well, I only caught on to the last 15, 20 minutes here. In fact, I'm just catching on a little bit. I was intrigued basically by finding out that she originally was from the Chicagoland area, But just real shortly, picking up on that last phone call and her comments, Anna, related to, different versions and whatever. I have some poems that actually go up to version 8, believe it or not. And it's over the years, and I started writing in, 1967, I think. But, I've just thought about it when I was listening there that, there's a lot of reasons for this. One of them is you simply get older and look back at some of your childish poetry. Sometimes it's very good, sometimes it's not so good. But you go back and, for whatever reason, change a few words, change whatever. The other thing, too, is oftentimes I would get editor suggestions, and I learned to sort of take those seriously, because I don't have to follow those editor suggestions. But if they improve what I think the quality of the poem is, I make that another version. And I don't know about you, Anna, and I don't know if you do video poems. I do a lot of them on YouTube. But I found out that if I practice vocally before I finalize a poem, I often see many of the errors there, because I can go back and hear them, feel them, sense them, and see, quite honestly, some of the stupidities of my errors. Have you ever had that experience, Anna?
Yeah. Well, I'm glad. Thank you for your call, and I'm glad that this is brought up. And we often talk about whether poetry should be read in silence, to yourself, or reading it out loud, and that's an excellent point. Is reading out loud, and anything. I've read my novels in progress out loud to myself. I always do that, so that I can catch those places where the commas have been misplaced and the pauses are off and the words are misspelled and so on. The poetry is particularly special in that sense. So I would say that even if it's just to yourself, you can catch a lot just by reading it out loud. And or if you're lucky enough to have a friend or somebody that wants to hear you read it for the 10th, 12th, 15th time, they might catch something that you're not seeing anymore.
Ironically, I don't have that friend. I mean, well, I shouldn't say I don't have that friend list, but not really. I don't have that many friends. On the other hand, I don't have any. Well, I have maybe one person that has an interest in poetry, but you know how that goes. But anyway, the bottom line of all of that is, what am I thinking
There's
about?
There's a poem
here?
right there.
Well, sort of. Give me a break. But anyway. By the way, you're about my age. What a handsome-looking lady you are. Handsome is reserved for men. Isn't that correct, Michael?
Yes, it is.
My husband's listening to the show, by the way.
Michael always knows I have a sense of humor hidden back behind the wall someplace.
Michael is the man.
Yeah, not really. But I don't know. And at a certain point, you just, like you're saying, there's no end to this. But one of the beauty, at least I find in poetry, is that you do have, guess what, the freedom of doing what you want, what subject you want, changing what you feel like. You may get criticized for it, but you know what? We're not in this for the money because we're not getting rich. They're going to remember us only after we're cremated.
Well, think about the fact that I announced to my parents after college I was going to be a poet. My older sister was going into business, and she was downtown in Chicago, and I said, well, I'm going to be a poet, and the dead silence that fell around the room there.
What she probably says, you're starting out as an alcoholic early, right?
No, I don't think they had any sense of the association with writers and alcohol.
Yeah. Well,
my mother actually liked poetry, and she would quote poems in Spanish to me. But she thought of writers as from the Bohemian era, from the early 20th century, and so she thought of me as I progressed and became successful, and she traveled to some places
at least you got some encouragement.
She was Bohemian.
That's unusual from a I'm 73. I'll soon be 74. So I mean, you've got a few more years to go before you become an adult. Okay, but I think we're sort of in that same era. My daddy was a factory worker. My mommy worked in a hospital washing dishes. They weren't really into that too much. So, if you had a mother that was that enlightened, I think you were sort of a lucky person.
Yes, indeed.
All right.
My mother worked in a factory, but she liked poetry.
All
well,
right.
you know what? But that isn't that sort of encouraging?
Yes, it is.
Yes,
all
of
things
course.
Considered.
So thank you, Michael.
Thank you, Michael. That's it, buddy.
All right, my friend.
Have a good evening. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you so much.
Well, it's all right. You know what? You get a couple more minutes, and I'm going to just get off the phone here and listen on the other end. Talk to you later.
All right, sir.
Thank you.
All right. Anna.
Yes.
Please
Michael
share another
Anthony.
poem. Please share another poem.
Well, let's see. I'm looking for small, short poems.
What about reflection? I liked reflection.
Well, I have a short poem,
okay,
and it's called "What is Your Writing Process?"
Okay.
And I think this might, speak to a subject on your program.
Mm-hmm.
So, what is your writing process? This is a question most writers and poets get asked, and teachers. With mop in one hand, cocktail in the other, at 9 a.m. or night. Flies swatted, roach corpses swept, Lola Beltran belts mi ranchito, through house speakers from room to room. I hum off-key, mares fed, dogs let out, sun beating on the flat roof, moon rising behind a cloud, verses take form. Thank you. So I know I see a lot of things on social media where people say, yeah, it sounded really good when I was taking a shower, the writing I was doing, and then when I went to write it down, it left my head. And that's really what the writing process is. It comes to you in the middle of housework or, in the shower or washing dishes, doing something else. It comes to you, and then it's like, now I've got to go get a pen or my iPad and start working.
All right. We'll be right back, okay? Take one brief break here before we end tonight. One last break with Anna, and we'll be right back.
Thank you.
We are back. I am here with Anna Castillo. Anna, question for you before we go. Your book, My Book of the Dead, what did you learn about yourself writing this book?
Well, thank you for asking that. I have learned once again about my resiliency. I felt, and I've mentioned this a few times with interviews recently, and I think it's very important to talk about. I fell into a very deep depression starting around the elections of 2016 into 2017, and I thought I would not write anymore. I have 5 novels published. I've published critical essays and personal essays and so on and so forth, but it stopped for me. And in 2018, on New Year's Eve, I decided that I could write or finish writing this book of poems, one poem at a time. And so I would say it's resiliency. I've come too far to turn back now. So and it's, you take one step at a time, and you feel the accomplishment of each poem, and so it taught me that. And it's also teaching me that no matter what is going on, how small my voice may be in this world, as a brown woman, as a woman of Mexican descent, indigenous background, of not great economic means or influences, that I have power in this little voice, in these little poems. They give me strength and power personally. And then when I hear from one person, and it doesn't matter where it comes from, someone I don't know, I feel my job is done. That says I connected with that. It changed my life. I had a young woman say to me once that reading one of my books not only transformed her life, she went on and became a physician, a doctor. And I've heard that numerous times since then, and I'm so impressed. I'm like a happy mom to hear that. But wow. That's what the book taught me, that amidst the death, 1,000 people were dying a day last year. I suffered many personal losses and challenges like so many people, and we were having natural catastrophes, and the Amazon was burning. And for me to say, I'm going to write a poem about that, taught me that all of us have that power within us to rise up, like the phoenix, and see a new day. That's all we can do. All of us have to do that.
Wow. So nicely stated. Do you think that you were meant to be a poet?
I don't know. I don't know. I've not.
Honestly,
I've not,
you don't know. You don't know after all you've done. After all you said, you don't know.
No, I don't know. And again, I think about mothers, and I think about a book that I read many years ago, an anthology about by Middle Eastern writers, and something stuck with me, and it's been decades, by a woman who said, I was born to be the mother of XY, whatever her son's name was, who was a poet. I came to this world to be the mother of this poet. And I thought, it's always stayed with me, because I thought, what a beautiful, noble gesture to think, this is the reason why you came into this world, to be the mother of a poet. But for me as a poet, I'm not sure. I think that it was a blessing. If I do it well on a certain day, I think that's good. I don't think I always do it well, but it was a decision for me to have a voice, because many people from my background don't have a voice, or they get lost. So, yes. And to be a poet is such a great honor, because you have a voice. And so I'm not sure that I was born to be the poet, but some days I'm lucky, and I am, and some days, we're busy doing other things. There's so much to do.
Well, I think, based on what I know, what I've experienced during this hour, and what I've read, that you were meant to be a poet. That's my...
Oh, God bless you. Thank you. I'll take that in this
Thank
hour.
you. Well, I'd like to thank you for sharing your time with me tonight. This has been really nice, special, more than you'll ever know. Just hearing your voice, I was going to ask you, what is the difference between your speaking voice and your written voice? And I think maybe you've answered that already. Do you think are there any qualitative differences between the two, because you speak so eloquently? Are there any differences between the two?
Well, thank you for the eloquence compliment, but I do recommend people to use the voice that they're most comfortable with to tell their stories, and this is my voice. So I don't know if it works, and it works for some people, and maybe for others not so much. But this has been my well, it's a struggle, because as a person who was initially a Spanish speaker, it's never left me. And, it's pointed out to me that I almost have like a different personality when I speak in English. So, but I do my best. I do my best in English, and I do my best in Spanish. So, but I thank you for your time, and most especially for appreciating poetry.
Well, thank you. So good night to you. Be safe. Take care.
Thank
and I wish you nothing
but the
best.
Thank
all
you.
Right.
Thank you.
Good night, everyone.
Good
night, everyone.
All the best to you.
Yes. To our listening audience, as usual, let poetry ring, and I'll talk to you next week.
You have just listened to the Quintessential Listening Poetry Online Radio Podcast with your host, Dr. Michael Anthony Ingram. Subscribe to our podcast on iTunes, Spotify, or Stitcher. And make sure to catch our next episode.